If you're not already subscribed to this YouTube channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button now, along with the bell icon so you can be notified whenever a new video is posted. And if you're already subscribed, check and make sure that YouTube hasn't unsubscribed you. And of course, be sure to give the video a like as well as share it on your social media. The white supremacists hate that. And now, the Sunday address.
Well, the truth of the matter is that the civil rights movement and King were not a force for good. Really what they were a force for federal expansion and the USSR propaganda.
Before we begin, let's understand something. Whenever anyone calls themselves wanting to talk to me or try to tell me something, the very first thing that you're supposed to do is to consider the source. We've been seeing for the last few years, and probably the last 2 or 3 years in particular, an intense effort to try to rehabilitate slavery and to try to find a way to go ahead and bring back all of that stuff from the 60s and such, attacking Dr. King, trying to claim that Dr. King was this, that, and the third. The white right's been doing this. As Dr. John Henrik Clarke said, when you start seeing this stuff just being pumped out like so much Nazi propaganda, that's how you know somebody wants this out here. Enter Jason Whitlock, somebody who nobody wants out here. He posted a video claiming that he was going to be having a so-called debate about Martin Luther King and his legacy. Now, if you actually expect anything intelligent or worthwhile from Jason Whitlock, you're the idiot. Whitlock is himself desperately trying to get some white media company or other, maybe a wealthy white person, to become his sponsor. This little video debate, quote-unquote, was actually done by The Blaze, so what does that tell you? This debate's not a debate at all. It's just a pathetic mixtape for bootlicks, and neither of these two so-called debaters was actually disagreeing in any meaningful way. Both of them basically agreed that Dr. King wasn't really a Christian, and Dr. King was an adulterer and a million other things, all of this with no evidence whatsoever, so this is supposed to be the participants in a debate? Well, who do we have here? First of all, we got a guy named Chad O. Jackson. He's basically the Timu version of Dinesh D'Souza, and Dinesh D'Souza is himself the garbage version of Michael Moore. Now, this Chad Jackson character, he's also got a video that Jason Whitlock has been pimping, attacking Dr. King in the form of a so-called documentary. That's what this guy's trying to do, and this is what the game is for him. So this is the guy who Jason Whitlock and The Blaze gave a platform to say all sorts of gibberish about Dr. King. Basically what he says is the word Marxist so much I thought that was his name. Just to show you how profoundly incompetent this Chad O. Jackson character is, even though he had the friendliest of opponents, and really you can't call this guy an opponent, he was just a colleague is what he is. Nonetheless, Chad O. Jackson is so incompetent, he still found himself cornered repeatedly, and he was pathetically trying to duck, dodge, talk around the subject. But I found it to be perversely hilarious that this guy tried to claim he doesn't have a political home, that he's neither a Democrat nor a Republican.
And this is why, again, I don't really have a political home. I'm neither a Republican or a Democrat because I believe in the true intent and the true edicts of the Constitution.
I find it very interesting that he claims that because that's not what I found. Because when I looked it up, Chad O. Jackson ran for political office as a Republican. So yeah, he does have a political home after all, the GOP. But as he tried to do throughout this quote-unquote debate, he would name drop certain authors who he claimed to be from the left, and he would say, well, these are people who don't even agree with me. This is a guy who's trying to bestow legitimacy on his own empty, vapid talking points. And just to show you what a scatterbrained incompetent this guy is, he should have stuck to plumbing, really. He claimed that the civil rights movement were all just a bunch of communist dupes. They were totally infiltrated by communists. They took their cues from communists. Why, Joseph Stalin had them all on strings. And then when he was asked about whether or not he was in favor of segregation, this is what he says.
I argue that this is a force for bad and is a detriment to Black Americans and to America at large insofar that the communist ideology is antithetical to our way of life.
A few moments later.
I do, however, believe in desegregation. In other words, I don't believe that there should be laws on the books where the state is forcing segregation. And so to that extent, I do believe that those laws should be done away with. And those laws were being done away with. I mean, whether you're talking about, from the turn of the 20th century into the middle part of the 20th century, you did see some of these laws being repealed and giving credit where credit is due. The NAACP were taking some of these cases to court and they were having victories in the courts.
You get that? He says that he's against segregation because he believes in freedom of association, so the state should not have the ability to order people to be separate from each other. People should decide on their own. And then when it came time to talk about the laws that were on the books to do that, laws put on the books by good white Christians, not Marxists, what he does is he credits the Marxist front group, the NAACP, with having taken those laws down. So simultaneously, it's the communists and the Marxists who are responsible for all the evil in the world, and simultaneously they're also responsible for the one good thing that's contributed the most to his life and his success. So he goes from denouncing the evils and ills of these communist infiltrated organizations to giving them credit. They go from being the source of evil in the world and satanic. That's what he also said in this quote-unquote debate. He talks about Marxism as satanic. Okay, so that means that these civil rights groups are in league with the devil. And then he gives the devil his due. This is who the white right got to be their champion to go after Dr. King. This is how you know they're just scraping the bottom of the barrel. Any idiot who's willing to stumble in and say, I sell the soap for your masses, they'll go ahead and put you in front of a camera. Why not? What have they got to lose? But then again, he's palling around with the likes of Jason Whitlock, so losers of a feather fail together. And so who's supposed to be the opponent who's going to be debating this Jackson guy? He's debating someone named Delano Squires. So obviously Squires has to be better, or at the very least different than this Chad O. Jackson fool, right? Well, have you looked at who Delano Squires is? Because if you did, the very first thing you'd find is he works for the Heritage Foundation. Now, if you ever listened to me for any length of time, you know that the Heritage Foundation is essentially the successors to the John Birch Society, funded by the exact same individuals like the infamous Joseph Coors of the Coors beer family. If you want the background on that, you can check out the video on this channel, Why Roger Ailes Isn't Going Away. But that's who the Heritage Foundation is. They're a right-wing hate engine, no different than the Manhattan Institute. So the guy who's supposed to be defending Dr. King in this case, he actually is mobbed up with this white supremacist think tank. This is who the Blaze has in there. So as usual, white supremacy believes in taking both sides of the conversation. That's what this is. But in this case, if you choose to watch this quote-unquote debate, and I don't recommend that you do, but if you're masochistic enough to do it, you're not going to be having both sides of anything. You're just basically these two having some little squabbles over some minor points before they go ahead and have a sloppy love fest of agreeing on everything else.
But was Martin Luther King a Christian?
You want to skip down there?
No. I'm going somewhere with this. But
do I believe he was a Christian?
Yes. Was he a Christian?
The stated views on core Christian doctrine that I've seen from Dr. King, from the writing of his own hands, put him, in my perspective, outside of biblical orthodoxy. If he never repented from those views, then I would not see him as someone who was spiritually regenerate. Okay. So I would answer that question in the negative.
How important to his legacy is Dr. King's moral failure, the playing around with women and all of that, that's all been addressed here recently and brought out over the last 20, 30 years. Mm-hmm. Delano first. 3 minutes here.
Sure. I mean, I certainly do think it's important because for many people, especially older generations, they see King as equal rights, sort of civil rights activist and moral leader. So when you hear that someone who you idolize had serious moral failings, and I certainly would put adultery in that category, I do think it taints the legacy a great deal.
Both of them are anti-King. It's just that one of them is blatantly and egregiously anti-King, while the other one tries to be a little bit more erudite with his anti-King rhetoric. Now, this Chad Jackson guy, he clearly is a sock puppet for the white right. He does everything he can, ready to jump out a window to just repeat all sorts of gibberish about Dr. King that had already been debunked back in the 1960s, but it just goes to show who this guy's real audience is. Now, while Delano Squires may be an employee of the Heritage Foundation, I think that it's this Chad O. Jackson character, he ought to be getting a check from them as well, because after all, these guys are the successors to the John Birch Society, and that's important because the Birchers back in the 60s, they put up a massive nationwide campaign to defame and attack the character of Dr. King. These guys paid to put up billboards across the South, falsely claiming that Dr. King went to a so-called communist training school.
He would later go to a communist training school in Tennessee called Highlander Folk School.
Yeah.
No such thing ever existed. Communists didn't go to any classrooms. There was no curriculum. There was no communist university. Nobody ever graduated from any communist school. You didn't get a degree or certificate. What they were doing was they were doing what the white right always does. If there's somebody who says something that they don't like, they say, this person's a communist. That's why these universities, they got communist teachers there. No, they don't. What the Birchers did was to deliberately and intentionally mischaracterize a particular school as being a, quote, communist training school. What happened was Dr. King had been attending a workshop at a place called the Highlander Folk School. I know you never heard of it, so let me describe it. It was a place founded in 1932 by a white man, Miles Horton, and he founded it in Tennessee, which was the birthplace of the Ku Klux Klan, and it was also where Dr. King would be assassinated in 1968. He was assassinated not by communists, but by peaceful white Christian conservatives. The Highlander Folk School was started to provide educational opportunities for poor white people in Appalachia. It would be decades later when the Highlander School began to integrate its classroom, and as a result, they made inroads with the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council. The Highlander School considered itself to be more open-minded than the rest of the South, which wasn't a high bar to get over. As a result, they had Baptist preachers like Dr. King and had Catholic priests visit their schools, something communists didn't do in the Soviet Union, which was a secular state. But people like the Birchers always conveniently leave out that detail, as do the Chad O. Jacksons. So that's what the Highlander School was. I guess they would call themselves open-minded white Southerners. And at a time when every other school in the South, and a large number of them in the North, were fighting integration, the Highlander Schools was actually supporting it, and they had already been doing it, and they supported civil rights openly. And that's why in 1961, the Tennessee legislature revoked the Highlander School's educational license as retaliation for their supporting civil rights. This is the same Tennessee legislature that even today selectively enforces laws against its political opponents. The times don't change because these people don't. So no, the Highlander School was not then, nor was it ever a, quote, communist training school. Anything associated with challenging the white status quo or civil rights was always called communist then, and they still try to go ahead and recycle that now. And characters like this Jackson guy, he's just regurgitating the John Birch Society's long-dead talking points from the 1960s in the hopes that you won't know any better. After all, these are events from 70 years ago. But keep in mind, something about the accusation King and the rest of the civil rights movement were communists. The actual FBI documents are available online, family. Did you know that? Apparently, Chad O. Jackson didn't. You can actually read the so-called evidence the FBI claimed to have, and when you look at the documents, you see that what they say is they have a secret source who was telling them things about racial going-ons in New York and such. And that, well, they can't tell anyone who the source is, not even the FBI itself, because, well, this is an informant. As we all know, of course, the informant was exactly how law enforcement was trying to spread disinformation among these groups. It wasn't about public safety, it was about white control. Family, how many times have these so-called law enforcement agencies had some confidential informant who they used to put cases on people? Come to find out later on, the informant was usually lying, or we find out that the so-called informant never existed in the first place, that the police were the ones just making stuff up. Well, the FBI, especially under J. Edgar Hoover, did the same things during the civil rights movement. White FBI agents would say stuff, they would send letters, make harassing phone calls, spread rumors, or, as the FBI called it, COINTELPRO. Or don't you find it just a little bit strange that if Chad O. Jackson and his buddy Squires and all their predecessors are correct, and for the last 70 years there's been a ton of evidence that King was a communist or an adulterer, why has no one ever presented even one scintilla of evidence to support it, even once in 70 years? If King was indeed a communist, why was he never hauled before Congress for that? Why didn't J. Edgar Hoover ever bring a case against King for spying for the Russians or gathering information for the Russians? With all of the evidence that we've been told by the white right exists against Dr. King, nobody ever actually presents any, and nobody ever tried to. Why was neither King nor any of the other civil rights movement leaders or participants ever found to be giving aid, comfort, or even a compliment to the communists? If Chad O. Jackson is correct and the movement was invented by the communists, then why is there no one who can present proof, not even Chad O. Jackson and J. Edgar Hoover, to support that? Name dropping this or that person, Philip Randolph or FDR, that's not evidence. Hell, even this Delano Squires guy had to admit that. Even he had to say, just doing all this name dropping, that's not proof.
This goes back to the 1930s under the FDR administration, where you had the National Negro Congress, which was started by a commission out of the FDR administration and Joseph Stalin himself.
FDR wasn't a communist, nor was he in league with the civil rights movement. The New Deal was done to pacify the lower white classes and to keep them from doing what was happening in places like Russia at that time, overthrowing the upper class and killing them. FDR himself came from a prominent rich white family, and he had been governor of New York, and as a result, he was constantly surrounded by bankers and financial types like the Dulles brothers, who had been powerful Wall Street lawyers. So the idea that Roosevelt was working hand in hand with communists is beyond ridiculous. His Secretary of the Navy, a little bigot named Frank Knox, was also a prominent newspaper publisher in Chicago. Frank Knox had run against Roosevelt in 1936 and got crushed in that election, and so he used his newspaper to criticize Roosevelt and the New Deal constantly, that is, up until the moment Roosevelt offered him that cabinet position as Secretary of the Navy. Then Knox calmed down, but he never stopped his opposition to anything doing with civil rights.
The USSR, the Soviet Union, literally called the civil rights movement in America the strategic propaganda asset, because that's exactly what they were.
And this is what this guy did for the entire debate family. This is just a snippet of the gibberish that this guy was spewing. This is somebody who was desperately looking for a coherent thought and failing to do so. Just this barrage of word salad. Just an avalanche of unrelated gobbledygook that's not even coherent or connected. He just makes a bunch of vague, completely unsubstantiated claims that there was direct and indirect lines of communication, which brings us to his claims basically against the civil rights movement in general, starting with besmirching A. Philip Randolph and others, saying that the National Negro Congress was started out of a commission from the Roosevelt administration.
When you look at King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, there was a direct line and an indirect line of communication between them and the Soviet Union. This goes back to the 1930s under the FDR administration, where you had the National Negro Congress, which was started by a commission out of the FDR administration and Joseph Stalin himself.
That's not true at all. It was actually started at Howard University in 1935. Here's what he didn't tell you. A light-skinned Harvard graduate named John Preston Davis was a journalist and activist in African-American circles. In 1933, John Davis attended a National Recovery Administration hearing, and this light-skinned black man saw that under the allegedly radical communist and liberal FDR, there wasn't a single person at the National Recovery Administration who represented or even mentioned black people's interests. So John Davis contacted a fellow Harvard graduate, Robert Weaver, and the two of them formed what they called the Negro Industrial League. But that only survived for the summer of 1933, when Weaver was suddenly asked by the FDR administration to become a race advisor to the Interior Department. So a few months later, around the end of 1933, John Davis continued his activities by starting a new organization called the Joint Committee on National Recovery. Yeah, very similar to FDR's National Recovery Administration's name, and that was for a reason. This was not in any way connected to FDR. It was a network of black organizations, most notably the NAACP. The purpose of this Joint Committee on National Recovery was to challenge FDR's New Deal program, specifically the anti-black policies that had been written into those programs. You see, John Davis and his friends, they didn't start that organization to support the New Deal or Roosevelt. They did it to challenge him. Eventually, the NAACP and John Davis couldn't see eye to eye on things, so when the NAACP withdrew their support, the JCNR was basically defunct. In May of 1935, John Davis and a number of other black luminaries attended a conference at Howard University during which Davis advocated for the creation of the National Negro Congress. The men who were involved were people like Ralph Bunche, A. Philip Randolph, Charles Hamilton, and others. Neither Roosevelt nor Joseph Stalin had anything to do with the creation of the National Negro Congress. And the only quote-unquote committee that the National Negro Congress came out of was John Davis's own Joint Committee on National Recovery, which was not a White House anything. That's the reason why Chad O. Jackson didn't present any proof of Stalin doing anything, Stalin making any recommendations or saying, here's what we want our Negro puppets to do. There was none of that. Instead, he just name drops Joseph Stalin and walks on. No proof whatsoever. The National Negro Congress's agenda was to promote legislation that was promoting better working conditions and trying to get black people into government jobs. Why? Because that's how FDR was lifting white America out of poverty. If the private sector wasn't creating any jobs, he would have the public sector do so. Except they were writing these programs specifically in order to regulate black people out of these job fields. That became the MO of these organizations like the National Negro Congress, to make the radical communist FDR simply act like a human being. There were those even back then who claimed that the group was promoting communism at their meetings, but a congressional investigation after the conference found no evidence whatsoever that the attendees advocated a turn to communism. So the FDR and Stalin connection is debunked. But what about A. Philip Randolph handing the communist reins over to King? Family, there was no camaraderie between FDR and the civil rights activist. In fact, the first known recording made by the White House taping system was a meeting held between FDR and A. Philip Randolph, Walter White, who was head of the NAACP, and T. Arnold Hill from the Urban League on September 27, 1940. They told FDR that he had to stop the discrimination in government agencies, specifically the military. FDR told them, well, that's just too complicated and I'm doing my best and you can't rush these things. A. Philip Randolph was head of the country's largest black union, and he told Roosevelt that he would bring 100,000 of these black men to demonstrate on July 1st, 1941, 10 months into the future. FDR engaged in an intense effort to stop this from happening. In fact, he had his wife Eleanor, who he used as his go-between, to see if she could talk them out of it. I want my listeners to take note of that. The oh-so-liberal FDR didn't talk to these black men himself. He sent his wife to do it. From Susan B. Anthony to the present, whenever white power is trying to mislead or otherwise dissipate the revolutionary black energy, their first move is often to send a white woman to do it. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote to A. Philip Randolph threatening him, saying, "I feel strongly that your group is making a very grave mistake." This is how the oh-so-liberal communist FDR's wife was talking to these communist black civil rights activists. This is how you talk to your enemies, family, or should I say slaves, not to communist fellow travelers. FDR himself had a southern white so-called liberal who he tasked with going to Eleanor and getting those unruly Negroes under control, or as FDR put it, go to New York and try to talk Randolph and White out of this march. Get the missus and get it stopped. Randolph and White stuck to their guns, and Roosevelt ultimately acquiesced, albeit reluctantly, and he eventually signed an executive order calling for a Fair Employment Practice Committee. But Randolph and White were not satisfied with that. They said that it was too small in size and budget to take on the military-industrial complex. So Roosevelt ultimately had to bolster it later on. But my point is, where's the communist conspiracy here? You have the civil rights activists at war with FDR and his wife. FDR was opposing them. He wasn't on their side. And this was just one of many battles the civil rights movement had with FDR. But Jackson conveniently doesn't mention any of this. See, I give you names, dates, places, events. I don't just give you unsubstantiated innuendo and name dropping. And as for Randolph handing control of this communist organization to King, have you ever noticed how nobody ever presents evidence that King was a communist? They just say that he was. That's what they said about all the civil rights movement. That's what they said about the labor unions. They said these are all just communist organizations. Then why was Dr. King never brought before the House Un-American Activities Committee? That committee was in operation from the 1930s right up until 1975, basically the end of the Vietnam War. Dr. King had been dead and buried for 7 years before HUAC, as it was called, was finally abolished. They had decades to go after the man, so why did neither Hoover nor Barry Goldwater nor any of these other red-hot racists in D.C. see fit to drag the arch-communist King before their committee so they could expose him before the world? After all, they had tons of evidence against him, right? They've been doing all of these little whisper campaigns, telling the public, telling other people in the civil rights movement, why Dr. King, he's not a good guy, he's not this saint that you think that he is. They were saying that for year after year after year. So why not go ahead and drag him before Congress, expose him in front of the world, and show everybody, see, he's not what you thought. Why didn't they just do that? This is why for nearly 20 years I've been telling you that these are lies about Dr. King. All these decades, and nobody has ever brought even one piece of evidence to support the slander. King was a communist. King was an adulterer. He had 5 kids out of wedlock. He was related to the Martians. The feds had a camera and a microphone on Dr. King and everyone he knew 24/7, year upon year upon year, and yet, with over a decade of round-the-clock surveillance, neither Hoover's FBI, nor Barry Goldwater's Republican Party, nor the white media, nor any of the white racists who were hunting Dr. King day and night ever obtained a scintilla or even one iota of proof of King doing anything bad. And yet, when you ask for the proof, what do the right-wing nuts and even a few racists on the left say? They say, well, someone said that he did back in 1965. Gee, what does that sound like, family? Sounds to me like someone saying to take the word of an anonymous informant. Someone whose identity you don't know, who most likely is a white FBI agent putting this or that out there. But take their word for it, it totally happened. In fact, that's the main thing that this Jackson character does throughout this so-called debate. He just makes one unfounded assertion after the next. He admits that there's no proof, but then says, sure, there's no proof, but you have to understand, that's how these communists are.
He was a sneaky Marxist. Let me just say it that way. People have to understand, if you are looking for Martin Luther King to say in writing or out of his own mouth, I am a communist, you'll be hard pressed to find that. And so it seems to me, Delano, with all due respect, that that's exactly what you're looking for.
Do I expect King to say that he's a Marxist? No, I do not. But when he writes specifically of the incompatibility between Christianity and communism, and Chad's response is, well, of course he would say that he's a Marxist. Then at a certain point, this is a circular argument, right?
The standards that you lay out as far as what would qualify him as a communist, I get where you're coming from, but I would challenge you to look at how communism, the subversive means by which it spread, and you'll see that King was doing exactly that.
Again, I think you are making a conclusion where an argument needs to be.
There's a rule about debates. If you have no evidence, that means you also have no case. Unsubstantiated claims, innuendo, outright lies. This is what the white right's slander campaign against Dr. King was and continues to be. And I found it hilarious that this clown, Jason Whitlock in this case, actually thought that he would get some traction for himself by doing multiple videos attacking Dr. King. This is somebody who's trying to trip the algorithm. In one of these videos he posted, he wrote the description that Chad What's-His-Name walks through Marxism and how it used slavery and MLK as devices to push its own ideology. First of all, I think we can all agree that neither Jason Whitlock nor this other mental midget, Chad O, and I think O stands for obtuse, neither one of them can actually define Marxism or give you the story behind it. Like all right-wing nuts and their mouthpieces, they use words they don't actually know the meanings of, like woke. And they invent these secondary negative definitions meant to push their own racial narrative. These asinine claims that Joseph Stalin was behind this, that, or a third. He says that they were all communists. There was a line of direct and indirect communication between the Soviet Union and the civil rights movement. He just can't tell you who it is or show you what these lines of communication are, but take his word for it, it did happen. And just to show you this clown doesn't have the sense that God gave a dog, he name drops Thomas Sowell.
As Thomas Sowell documents, as well as the late Walter E. Williams and other scholars, you saw this kind of upward mobility, this upward trajectory on the part of colored people from the 19th century well into the 1940s and 50s.
Family, I've been saying it and will keep saying it. If you hear somebody name drop Thomas Sowell and you hear this person praising that guy, that's somebody you can stop listening to them right then and there. They're certified stupid. Thomas Sowell is not and has never been a scholar. He's just been nothing more than a sock puppet with an economics degree, but the white people who put him on TV back in the 80s, they only did so he could talk about the black community. He's got an economics degree, but none of his white boosters ever asks his opinion about the economy. You'll know when white people take somebody seriously, because that's who they'll go to when it's time to talk about their money. No one ever has or would ever take any of Thomas Sowell's asinine scribblings about economics seriously. Even the white right doesn't. And secondly, Thomas Sowell's been one of the main chumps who invented the lie about black immigrants are more successful than foundational black Americans, so that proves that racism isn't holding the black community back. Why? It's just a faulty culture that black people refuse to address. That is, right up until the Trump administration began deporting black migrants and claiming that they commit all these crimes and that these people don't have any businesses, they just rip off the taxpayer. Now the same Thomas Sowell doesn't talk like that anymore. You can't get him to spout that gibberish anymore. And I have to say that I was disgusted but not surprised that this guy referred to black people as colored people.
You saw the spirit of embitterness really enter colored culture, what we now call black culture.
This is someone who's a trained fool whose every utterance is meant to appeal to a small audience of wealthy, old white men who he wants money from. He's not old enough to be referring to black people as colored. You have to be pretty old to get a stretch like that. But the white men that he wants money from, they're that old, and he's imitating their verbiage. That's who he's auditioning for. That's the real audience he's trying to reach with all of this performative extremism on his part. Also, Marxism had absolutely nothing to do with slavery. Capitalists created slavery. Capitalists were the ones who established it, they were the ones who spread it, and they were the ones who fought to preserve it. Capitalism, left to its own devices, will inevitably create systems whereby state-sanctioned brutality and exploitation are required in order to enrich a few at the expense of everyone else. That's why it keeps happening over and over again. Everywhere capitalism is tried, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Capitalism, in its total obsession with getting the most profits for the least amount of money or effort, demanded that slavery exist. Capitalism made it where the slave ships were insured by companies like Lloyd's of London. Capitalism was what the founders of the U.S. were thinking about when they wrote into law that black people were only 3/5 human beings. Capitalism required that they do that. Because when you take capitalism to its ultimate extreme, slavery is what you get. You cannot put a price tag on a human being, except that's exactly what capitalism did. It put a price tag on black people. But in order to try to maintain its pathetic veneer of morality, it said, well, these guys aren't really human beings. Okay, well, maybe they're human beings, but they're not totally human beings. Capitalism did that. Because when you commodify people, you also make it instantaneous that you're going to devalue them. Otherwise, they would have had to consider something else other than how much money they can get out of these black people who they had enslaved before they died. When the slave ships were bringing people here, the satanic businessmen who were behind it calculated how many people they would have to bring in order to make the trip profitable. Now, 90 days in a sweltering oven where there's no toilet facilities and the place is never cleaned guarantees that a lot of the people locked in those hellish conditions won't survive. And that was also baked into the cake. That's why the ships were insured. The ships and their human cargo. It was so routine that slave ship captains knew exactly how many slaves they could afford to lose before it would be more profitable to just kill the rest of them rather than bring them to the slave markets. They would throw their victims overboard and then have Lloyd's of London or some other company give them the insurance payment. Capitalism made this a regular business, and a profitable one. And slavery had been raging like an out-of-control forest fire since at least 1619. That predates Marxism by over 200 years. If you want to understand white supremacy, then you need to understand this. Whatever criticisms this Chad O. Jackson wanted to level against the Marxists, you could do more of it against the capitalists. Because you see, the problem isn't capitalism or Marxism. The problem is white supremacy. Both of them do the exact same things in different ways for the exact same purpose and the exact same end. As Frederick Bastiat wrote, when plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men, in time they create for themselves a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. This encapsulates what white power did when it monetized anti-black racism, and why it's also insisted on trying to deny its own immorality, or worse, claim that they were moral, well, by the standards of their time. This is how these racists live with themselves. Capitalism made anti-black racism profitable, and everyone from these white religions to white philosophers, even to their white scientists, declared it moral. No need to ignore one's own conscience when you've already created a social environment that says what you do is moral to begin with. If this Chad O. Jackson character wants to repeatedly say that Marxism is satanic because it doesn't acknowledge the existence of Jesus or God, then what do you say about a capitalist system that does acknowledge Jesus and God and then uses them to justify the worst crime in human history? What do you say about them? Well, if you're Chad O. Jackson, what you say is, you gotta break some eggs to make the omelet, and that was a long time ago. And you know, there were, in spite of itself, a few good things about slavery. There were some beneficial things that came out of it. There were some things that actually were beneficial to black people. He was running the old Ron DeSantis playbook on that one. But by far his most asinine utterance that he said over and over again was about people going to the government and this government intrusion. What I object to is government intrusion, is people going to the government and asking them to intrude.
if up to me, we would even go back before the Constitution to the Confederation of States, quite frankly. But I don't believe in this kind of, I don't like this thing happening in society. Let us run to the government and have them do something about it. I don't like that, because to the extent that you do that, it becomes this ever expanding thing.
This is exactly what white society has done since time immemorial. What do you think the Homestead Act was? They don't have to earn it. There's no need for them to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. We'll give them the boots and the bootstraps. And then, of course, after World War I, you had all of these returning white GIs who were given free government education. Then after World War II, they had a massively expanded program for that. If you were a returning white GI from the war, you got your education paid for, your first business was bootstrapped by the government, and they gave you low to no interest loans for a house. So you got to have your education, your business, and your home paid for on the taxpayer's dime. It wasn't the result of hard work. It was given to them by the government. Government intervention on an unprecedented scale for white people. Black people got none of that. And this is why white capitalists went to the government and demanded laws that said that it should be a requirement for them to do anything they want to make a profit. In the name of making money, anything they do should be legal. After all, it's a fiduciary responsibility, they called it. Now, when white capitalists talk about what they say a fiduciary responsibility is, they lead by mentioning empty phrases like perform all due diligence, protect assets, document decisions carefully. Nowhere does it say to not do something, because the entire point of fiduciary responsibility is to make money, usually by spending, or as they call it, investing someone else's money. This is the purest, or should I say dirtiest, example of how white power organized itself to force laws that legalize the very doctrines of greed, theft, plunder, exploitation, and destruction that we see these corporations carrying out. I'm not here to push capitalism or Marxism, because as long as white power is in control, these are just names for a white economy. The result of both of these systems will be the same. The only thing that might change is who the ultimate beneficiaries are. The problem is people like this Chad O. Jackson character is trying to pretend like there's a difference when there's not. Even if you agree with these two morons about Marxism or whatever, you see their arguments are based on talking points and not the facts. We have white racists, mostly on the white right, but occasionally you got some on the left, who rewrite history by saying slave owners took good care of the people they enslaved. They had to do it because these were investments, and they wanted to get the most out of their investment. Slavery wasn't as bad as you people try to make it out to be. It couldn't be. This is the well that this Chad O. Jackson character draws from. These are lies, and the people saying it know they're lying, but they also know that they lost the culture and the social narrative on this decades ago, because they couldn't actually defend slavery. So now they're pushing a hyper-aggressive agenda to try to redefine what it was. All of this with no proof whatsoever. But that's the main line that this guy was pushing, and you can tell that he got it from his white handlers. Be sure to talk about government intrusion. This federal intrusion. Stay with this federal intrusion. He repeatedly said that black people were leaning on the federal government and that the problem was federal intervention, federal intrusion. This guy doesn't know history, or rather, he's paid to ignore it. There's a reason why Reconstruction was the only period of anything resembling true progress for foundational black Americans. It was because the federal government had undertaken an unprecedented federal intervention, putting military troops in the South to enforce its laws and to prevent the white racists from trying to reassert themselves. This was when things like the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 was signed, whereby President Grant declared the KKK to be what they are, a terrorist organization. This was when the black universities and black freedmen's banks, when you had the introduction of large numbers of black people into elected office and prosperous black townships began to occur. This was when all of those things were happening as the direct result of federal intervention. Now, you can make the stupid argument that, well, it shouldn't have taken that, and yeah, if we didn't live under white supremacy, it wouldn't have been necessary. But we don't live in that world. We live in the world where white supremacy is in charge, and that we are fighting to tear it down. White people have been the uninterrupted beneficiaries of federal intervention for hundreds of years. And yet, the first and only brief period where the government at least made some gestures in black people's favor, all of a sudden the world is ending? No. This was actually the world turned right side up. And it was a success, and it was bringing America forward right up until the Compromise of 1877, in which Democrats and Republicans entered into a secret agreement to settle the 1876 election and make Rutherford Hayes president in exchange for withdrawing all federal troops from the South, which ended Reconstruction. Next thing you know, there began the lynchings, there began the cross burnings, there began all of the destructions of the black townships, segregation, Jim Crow. The Supreme Court made it clear that they were on the side of white supremacy and did so boldly. Constitution be damned. That's what happened when the federal government stopped its quote-unquote intervention. What was actually happening was they were actually acting like something analogous to a colorblind government, as opposed to the white supremacist racket that they had been before and afterwards. You cannot have economic empowerment when the dominant society legalizes using every governmental agency against you and crafting rules and practices specifically meant to target you. All of Chad O. Jackson's arguments are made in a vacuum. The problem is that vacuum is his empty head. And his other constant talking point that he used repeatedly was the word grievance.
And so, yes, this idea that it is a legitimate grievance, like this kind of feel sorry for me grievance rhetoric, exploiting grievances, that exploits grievances, pinching a grievance.
Nobody is more aggrieved than white society. Nobody claims to have more grievances than white society, who is also the most prosperous, the most pampered group in the society, and yet does the most complaining about nothing. Stoking phony grievance is what the white right does. It's how you had all of those performative extremists, all of those crisis actors who went from one school board to the next screaming and yelling, "I'm not going to have you teaching my children about slavery." And then they're threatening these teachers, threatening school board members, talking about what they're going to do. This is a group of people who are pushing grievance, and they're doing it specifically for the sake of trying to sanction violence. Chris Rufo and Ron DeSantis did that in Florida with all of their performative extremism, all of the stochastic terrorism, constantly talking about we're going to be fighting back and making it very clear black people are the target. That is, until you had white supremacists killing black people in these stores and Ron DeSantis trying to distance himself and say, "Oh, I had no idea this way. I don't know anything about it. I want you to know I object to it," which is a pack of lies. Now, those are actual examples of people stoking phony grievance for the sake of pushing some radicalist agenda. But Chad Jackson didn't have anything to say about that because the people that he wants to make sure he gets a check from are the ones doing it. It's so ridiculous that they're banning books because facts apparently hurt white people's feelings, and we have to protect their feelings from history. So now history books are white oppression? Again, family, the audience that morons like this Chad O character are trying to reach is a white one, specifically white donors. This is a fool auditioning for a job to sell the soap, or should I say sling the slime, for some wealthy white benefactor. These shills hope some white person with deep pockets and more money than sense will hear them saying all these lies and think, "Gee, I need to buy me this Negro over here and pay him money to say all this foul stuff for me." In the mind of the bootlick, that's how easy it ought to be, but it never occurred to them that these same white donors that they're trying to suck up to can't stand any black people and don't want any black people around, including them. Jason Whitlock is living proof of that. Even if he had talent or brains or work ethic or soap and water, he would still be right where he is right now. That little TV gig he had was never going to last for him any more than it would for Roly-Poly Martin, Joy Reid, or Don Lemon. White power keeps his bootlicks around until it's tired of looking at them. Then you're gone. And it doesn't matter what the alleged reason was. If it wasn't this, it would have been something else. But that's the main driver behind people like this. Anti-black racism pays. It don't pay big, but it pays something. And if you're somebody with no real talent or skill set, well, this is what you'll do. The people who are willing to pay for anti-black propaganda, they hate black people, though, including the likes of Chad O. Jackson and others who are so desperate to get a few crumbs from these people. Who's gonna tell them? No, seriously, who's gonna tell these morons that their little old shameless Sambo routine dried up a long time ago? They're coming to a party that was over years back. This little hustle don't work anymore. That finesse didn't pay much for the few who got a couple of pennies out of it, and these days it doesn't pay at all. It used to be offensive, now it's just sad. Charlie Kirk, by the way, was also running around saying the same crap as Chad O. Jackson, but the thing is, he was white. And that being the case, those millionaires and billionaires, they were willing to go ahead and put $100 million in his pocket. They were willing to do that for a white one. The only thing that Chad O. Jackson can do is to be their crash dummy. He might get paid $2 or $3 to go on Fox News and say something stupid, though I don't know if he's ever been on Fox. More likely he'll be on the internet. Maybe he gets something for that, a couple of pennies here and there to spout some inanity. But as far as getting the kind of money that the big grifters like the Charlie Kirks and the Ben Shapiros get, nah, there's not going to be any white fracking billionaires who are looking to give some money to the Chad O. Jacksons. He'll be put out there just long enough to spout some stupidity, and once he gives cover to these other racists, he's served their purpose. And this Jackson character, he himself admits that he's nothing but a rambler.
Anyway, I've been rambling.
Well, he was definitely right about that. He does do a ton of rambling. This guy is an expert at talking a lot while saying absolutely nothing. And this is what this guy did for 2+ hours. This Squires guy, I hope he was getting paid extra by the Heritage Foundation because he made sure to drop their little talking points, especially when he spent time after time downplaying and otherwise minimizing racism. He was doing everything that he could throughout this so-called debate to make it clear, well, regardless, racism, and that's basically more of a social fiction put forward by the left.
I do think it's interesting, though, because I feel at times you use Marxism the way the left uses racism, which is to say, around every corner and underneath every sheet.
Look, people have known since day one that there is not a cottage industry but a global industry marketing an anti-black racism. White power has done the most to popularize it and monetize it. This is where the bootlicks get all this enthusiasm about trying to attack black people from, and they're ready to jump out a window to say the most brain-dead crap. Mark Robinson, the failed gubernatorial candidate, said that black people should pay reparations to the U.S. Now, this kind of verbal vomit may delight white racists and conservatives, which is the same thing these days, but it won't bring you any success. The main motivator these fools like Whitlock have is that they want to get paid big off of being an anti-black grifter. They want the kind of mega millionaires and billionaires who bankroll Ben Shapiro and Andrew Breitbart, later Steve Bannon, and Charlie Kirk and Barry Weiss, these white racists who found it so easy to get hundreds of millions of dollars just thrown at them for nothing, and they've been living it up. That's why these bootlicks do this. That's what they want. But it doesn't happen, and it's not going to. Candace Owens, dumb as she is, was the only one who was smart enough to realize that licking Ben Shapiro's hairy behind was never going to pay off. So, give the heifer her due, she dumped them, and she had to build a right-wing grift machine of her own. At least she was realistic about that. And she's the only one who smartened up and pulled it off. Stephen Smith has been trying to do the same thing, but hell, his old colleague Keith Olbermann took shots at him, and Smith's on the defensive already, from a man who isn't even on TV anymore. Be it Jesse Lee Peterson, Stacey Dash, Larry Elder, Jason Whitlock, none of these bootlicks ever gets any higher than the occasional guest appearance on Newsmax, or if they're really entertaining, with the cooning Fox News. But that's it. White power has no permanent plans for any of them, and is not looking for a way to upgrade them either. The only thing more pathetic than their asinine attempts to attract white racist money is the fact that they're failing at it. But this is what Jason Whitlock's doing. In association with The Blaze, he's putting on stupid little public spectacles like this. You got these two magpies here, who you're told are going to be having a debate, but after about 30 minutes or so, they just drop the pretense that they were debating, and instead they go to agreeing on everything. These were just two tools having an empty conversation. And this is the reason why you don't hear me talking about people like this. They're not worth our time. And even if you had somebody like myself there to debate this guy, it wouldn't make much of a difference with him because he wouldn't actually admit that he was wrong. Hell, he didn't even do it with this tool Squires. He wasn't going to admit that he was wrong with this guy, even though he was stuck and cornered, though not as much as he should have been. Obviously, this guy has never locked horns with the black media, but given his pathetic performance with his colleague here in this phony pretend debate, this dude would get stomped out in no time flat if he made the mistake of trying that around the black media. So it's a good thing that these clowns do what they do. They're sticking to their staged little phony appearances like this, putting out their asinine little videos, which aren't even getting any traction. I guess they figured that they would sit here and say MLK was a communist and we're going to debunk him, and that's going to get all of these white racists who were licking Charlie Kirk's behind to come sniffing over here, but it didn't. When it comes to the anti-black bile, they prefer that it be slung by a white person. That's what the Jason Whitlocks and the Chad O. Jacksons and the Delano Squires will never understand. Then again, what else did you expect? As the old saying goes, it's impossible to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors: Mouse, Cornell Sly, Nathaniel Wilson, Lamont Ingram, and James Hampton. Salute to them, and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.